And of course there have been thousands of books produced on the crisis, lots of insights from insiders and some from outsiders. And I thought, well, what could I say that would be a bit distinctive? And this came to me actually in the process of writing the book when there was this wonderful moment when Her Majesty the Queen went to the London School of Economics to open some building. And she turned to the economists and said, how come you guys didn't see this whole thing coming? She didn't say it like that, but obviously would not. But, you know, she being a feudal monarch, I guess, demanded an answer. It's the kind of question that I would have of them, but they wouldn't listen and even bother to answer me, you know, or you for that matter. So the British Academy put together a whole group of top economists and the Governor of the Bank of England and all that kind of thing, and they deliberated seriously for 6 months or more, and then they wrote Her Majesty a letter in which they said, well, we were working very diligently on all the bits and pieces of how the economy works, and we were really doing a very, very good job, people dedicating their lives to this, but somehow or other in all of this we missed something called systemic risk. And that immediately alerted me, and I thought, well, what do they mean by systemic risk? And just recently, about 2 months ago, the IMF produced a paper in which it said the study of systemic risk is in its early stages. And the other ex-chief economists from the World Bank kind of said, well, we don't really know what systemic risk is, so we have to really, you know, start to really reconceptualize things. Now, to me, of course, systemic risk is probably the most important thing you should be looking at in any situation. And to me, translated into my language, systemic risks means the internal contradictions of capitalism. So I thought I might try and save the IMF a lot of trouble by presenting a very simple volume, which would explain to them what systemic risk under capital was all about. And to my astonishment, about 3 weeks ago, I got a rather nice review from the book section of the IMF in-house document. And it kind of, it was rather nice. It said, it ended up by saying, well, do I buy his arguments? No, not yet. But should you buy this book? Definitely yes. So my hope is that I'm going to convert the IMF into understanding the internal contradictions of capitalism. But my own aim out of this was to actually exploit the occasion of this particular crisis to reflect a little bit on why capital is so crisis-prone in general, and then try to resituate this crisis against, if you like, a general interpretation of crisis formation under capitalism. Now, this turned out to mean that I had to do this in a rather simplifying way, and in simplifying things, I found myself having to sort of brush aside a lot of the sort of convoluted and sometimes complicated thickets of Marxian arguments about this and that and that and this. And the result is a sort of stripped-down version of what I think Marxian thinking should be talking about in these times, and it's rather different from some of the other presentations that you might hear or understand. And there are three, I think, major modifications that I had to make before I could go ahead. The first was I had to actually reinterpret all of Marxian crisis theory. Typically that's been locked down into sort of a controversy over whether you should be talking about a profit squeeze, or whether you should be talking about a falling rate of profit, or whether you should be talking about an under-consumption crisis, which most Marxists would dismiss as being too Keynesian for comfort, so you can't talk about that. I had to push that all aside and actually come up with a system of thinking about what I call the blockages and potential crisis points in the circulation process of capital, and you can identify a whole number of these, any one of which can produce a crisis. And sometimes you get a crisis which looks like an under-consumption crisis. sometimes you get one which looks like a profit squeeze crisis, and others it looks like a sort of a technologically driven aspect of crisis. But in other words, I was driving to the point of saying there is no one singular notion of crisis we can point to. There is a system which has a whole series of blockage points, and each one of them is crisis prone, and I'll get back to what that means in a minute. This has not been terribly well received by many Marxists, and I can understand why. I mean, if you spend 30 years of your life arguing for the falling rate of profit theory, you try and squeeze the current crisis into the falling rate of profit theory, and frankly I don't think it works, and I think that when I come along and say, well, of course it doesn't work, people don't feel very happy about that, so you know, there's some criticism. The second area that I had to reflect upon is the notion of the proletariat and agencies of political transformation. And I've always taken the position that I thought this notion that somehow the proletariat was confined to factory labour, which was creating, of course, amongst North American Marxists, the real difficulty, the problem that a lot of factory labour was disappearing, so the proletariat was disappearing before their eyes, and then they were left with no agent to actually create historical change. And this, of course, has been a very important transformation in American life. I was reminded of this the other day when I was in Baltimore, and I met a steel worker who was still working at Bethlehem Steel, and he reminded me that back in the late 1960s they employed 37,000 people at Bethlehem Steel. And actually at that time, if we wanted to do anything politically, we would go to the Steelworkers Union, and if we had good relations with the president, the local president of the Steelworkers Union, we could get a hell of a lot done. So it was a very interesting kind of moment. Well, now there are about 2,500 people working in Bethlehem Steel, and the whole plant is going to be closed on November the 7th. So, you know, that's what I mean by the proletariat disappearing. But I never felt comfortable, even in those days, with saying, well, that's where the real action is. I mean, I was interested not only in factory labour, but in, for example, all those people who are engaged in city building and city maintenance. There's a whole huge wage labour force out there which is engaged in that, and why aren't we talking about them as part of the proletariat? There's also, of course, all of those wage labourers who are involved in service industries and the like. So it always seems to me that the conception of the proletariat is too narrow, really to work very well in terms of analysis. And secondly, I thought that the emphasis on the point of production, which is fundamental, particularly in a lot of theoretical Marxism, missed the point that a lot of politics occurs in the residency space, and that therefore I'd always tried to talk about class formation, both in the residency and also in the place of production. So to me, that had always been the case, but in this book I decided to come right out front and say, hey, forget about that, all that sort of usual kind of rhetoric about the proletariat in motion in the factories. Well, yeah, you may see some of that in China, but that's not what's going on around us, and in any case it's just not an adequate way to look at things, so I had to reformulate that, which again doesn't make great friends to you amongst the Trotskyist parties. The third modification was to really transform, go back and look at Marx's theory of social change and dialectics of social change. And again, there are a lot of one-liners that people debate, you know, all history is the history of class struggle, or you know, the changes in the productive forces actually transform society, and that's, you know, those sorts of things. But I went back, and since one of the virtues of teaching Marx every year for you know, about the last 40 years, is that I've become very, very closely concerned with what he's actually talking about in the text. And when you actually look at the way in which he talks about the transition from feudalism to capitalism, you get a completely different theory of social change, which rests on what I would call a co-revolutionary movement or a co-evolutionary movement between different moments in the social process. And I identify, coming out of Marx's general framework, a number of these moments. There is the technological moment, which is important, which is not only hardware technology, but also organizational form. There is the relation to nature moment, there is the production moment, there is the social relations moment, there is the daily life moment, there's conceptions, mental conceptions of the world, the institutional moment, and so forth. And you imagine all of these moments which have to shift and change if you're going to actually move from a feudal organization to a capitalist organization. But then I would argue that actually capitalism is internally dynamic and revolutionary, is constantly changing across all of those movements, all of those moments. and that the shift, for example, under neoliberalisation was a transformation of institutional arrangements, a transformation of technologies, a transformation of social relations, and of mental conceptions and all the rest of it. So that actually you would look at a co-revolutionary process internal to capitalism, which then transformed, if you like, the idea of revolutionary transformations moving away from capitalism into how do you guide this co-revolutionary movement, which is going on anyway, down different paths away from, if you like, the perpetuation of class power, the perpetuation and consolidation of that class power on a global stage. So that was, if you like, the third major modification that I had to make. So having, if you like, cruised my way through the thickets of Marxism and completely sort of disrupted a lot of general considerations, I then thought, well, okay, you can now set this to work to try to explain the actual dynamics of the crisis and what happened. Now, in explaining this, it seems to me there are two aspects to it. One is the geographical aspect and one is the temporal aspect. And in the end, of course, you have to put those two together. The temporal aspect is that I began to see very clearly that the creation of the present crisis was very much a function of the way in which we came out of the last crisis. And the last crisis was set up in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And it was a crisis which you could understand in a number of ways by the way in which, again, a configuration of forces locked together to actually preserve and, in some ways, enhance the power of labour relative to capital. And where this came from was partly the labour movement itself, which was relatively strong during the 1960s and 1970s, and I'm not talking only about the United States, I'm talking about Europe and at that time, these times, it was the centre of capitalist productive activity. But the other thing that locked it down was the organisation of, if you like, the world state system, which was set up in such a way that you had independent nation states which had a certain autonomy in terms of their fiscal policy. Now what this meant was that a rising labour movement with its political arm in socialist parties and social democratic parties could actually affect fiscal policies to change the social wage. And so you get the rise of the welfare state, and even in this country you get a considerable movement along those lines towards all kinds of regulatory configurations which are not necessarily favourable to capital. And things in particular of what happened in the 1970s when organisations like the Environmental Protection Agency, OSHA, consumer credit, all of those kinds of things started to come into the picture, which really did change the balance of power, and it was at that moment that capital started to organise its revolt through the Business Roundtable and the Chambers of Commerce and all these things, and they started to set up the think tanks, and they started to pervert the electoral process by grabbing congressional power. They formed what in the book I call the Party of Wall Street, which means that they implanted themselves both in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party to try to actually take over the political process of the country by using money power. And when the Supreme Court said that's okay because spending money is guaranteed under the Free Speech Amendment, you knew you were lost. This is legalised corruption, if you like. And so it was a legalised corruption of the political process in the 1970s, which then led into the kind of politics we see now, where this one party which we have called the Party of Wall Street is making absolutely sure that nothing happens which is going to challenge big capital and concentrations and centralizations of wealth that have been achieved over the last 30 years. So that was one aspect of the thing. So in order to get out of that framework where labour started to be very, very powerful, one of the ways to do it was to actually break open the nation state. And that's when we start to get this rhetoric about globalisation and the necessity for globalisation. But in order to do that, what you had to do was you had to deal with something else, which was mentioned at the time, which is very strange when we talk about it now, which is the notion of financial repression. The literature back in the 70s was very much about financial repression. And right now, of course, we're sitting around wishing there was a good deal more of it than there is. We've gone into this kind of irrational exuberance and infectious greed and all that kind of thing. But you have to take the brakes off finance, because if capital is going to offshore as one of the ways in which it can destroy the power of labour, then it needs financial institutions to flow the capital there and repatriate profits back and all this kind of thing. So you have to reconfigure, as it were, the whole organisation of the financial system. So the liberation of the financial system was in part a necessary condition in order to allow capital to offshore in order to break the power of labour within the nation-state apparatuses. Now this wasn't the only way, of course, in which you broke the power of labour. Earlier on you tried immigration, and actually the guest worker programs in Europe were a very good example of that. The reform of immigration law in this country in 1965 was a good example of that. And then, of course, there were all sorts of other ways, technological change, but here we get into another aspect of the thing. The pace of technological change was not so vigorous in the 1950s and 1960s because capital was also protected inside of these kind of cocoons of nation-state configurations. So during the 1960s, we start to get this formation of a theory of how capital works, which was called monopoly capitalism. And if you look at the configuration in Detroit Auto, there were 3 auto companies which dominated the US market. They were in an oligopoly position. They didn't innovate very much. They kind of, whenever workers made demands, they just caved into those demands and then passed it all along in terms of higher prices and the like. So actually, you have a kind of a monopoly situation which is emerging amongst big capital, which is paralleled by this other sort of aspect of labour also having power within the nation state. That too had to be broken, and so part of the breaking open of the nation state meant that capital started to become much more competitive. And so by the time you get into the 1980s and so on, you get the Japanese and the German auto companies coming in, and then other auto companies coming in, and in any sense, the oligopoly of Detroit got broken, and of course Detroit's never really recovered ever since, and still is sort of struggling to compensate for the much higher competitive situation that arose during the 1980s. Now these reforms in the 1970s were really configured around one central issue, which was to disempower labour relative to capital, and to re-empower capital, and in particular to re-establish the basis for capital accumulation and the centralisation of wealth and power within both the corporations but also within the capitalist class. And we've seen that process at work, of course, where the capitalist class has become very much wealthier, hugely so. The distribution of income has stagnated, has accelerated the concentration of wealth in the upper classes, so that you now have a far higher disparity in incomes now than was the case back in, say, 1970. The typical sort of distance between a CEO's remuneration and the average salary wage within a company was about 30 to 1 in 1970. And by the time you get to about 2008, something like that, it was something like 600 to 1. And of course, we all know the figures on income distribution, which went along with that. But the other side of that was, of course, once the power of labour was broken, capital could engage in a politics of what we call wage repression. And for the first time in American history, no gains in productivity actually went to benefit the working class. And wages essentially stagnated relative to all other forms of income. The share of wages in gross domestic product fell in nearly all of the OECD countries, and interestingly also the data on China shows the same thing. So, if you like, the share of labour of wages in the national output pie was steadily declining from the 1970s onwards. And what that immediately created were a whole series of interesting kinds of problems. The first problem was if workers are not being better paid, then who's going to buy the product? This is sort of all Henry Ford. This is where you shift and you suddenly wonder about the effective demand problem. You solved the labour problem now, which was a key difficulty in the 1970s. Are you now running into an effective demand problem? And there are various ways in which that was addressed, but one of the most important ways was to start to use the credit card kind of culture and start to encourage working class people to go into debt. So that household debt in the United States tripled from, say, around 1975 till recently. And the household debt is rising at an accelerating rate while wages are stagnant, and the gap, if you like, between the ability to support that debt and the volume of that debt is going pretty wonky. And that is, of course, one of the elements that led into the crisis in recent times. The second thing that happened was that capitalists themselves found themselves in a world which was much more competitive. You move from a situation of sort of cozy monopoly power to what capitalists sometimes call ruinous competition. So competition became much more intense during the 1980s and 1990s in particular. And when competition becomes much more intense, one of the things that happens is that actually puts pressure on prices, and that people cut prices in order to remain a competitive edge. And as a result of cutting prices, actually profits did start to go down in general. And this led into a very peculiar kind of economy in the 1980s, which was a low-wage, low-profit kind of economy. And this posed a certain problem because the capitalists are now accumulating vast amounts of money, thanks in part, of course, to Ronald Reagan's reform of the income tax structure, so that the top brackets who were paying, I don't know, 70 or 80%, suddenly found themselves only paying 35%, something like that. So suddenly the rich are being much privileged by the tax reforms. But then the big question was, what were they going to do with their money? Now, Ronald Reagan's argument is, give the rich a lot more money and then they'll invest it. And that'll create jobs, and therefore we'll all be better off by giving the rich a lot more money. That was the argument, and everybody then, familiar trickled down, or rising tide, or, rise all boats, all that kind of stuff. You heard that kind of rhetoric going on during the time. Now, the problem with this was that the assumption was that capitalists would actually invest in low-profit activities. And they didn't necessarily want to do that, and they would have started looking for ways in which they could invest in profits which were going to be easy profits. And so we start to find a whole set of investments which go into control over assets. Now, asset investments and asset markets work different from markets for widgets and automobiles. They work in such a way that they have a Ponzi character without necessarily burning Madoff at the top. I mean, if I invest in property market, the property prices start to go up, and somebody says, yeah, investing in the property market is a good idea, I'm going to invest in the property market. And others say, oh yeah, more and more. So actually more and more money pours into the property market, and property starts to sort of bubble. Same goes on with the stock market, with the new economy of the 1990s. The same happens with the art market, and then all kinds of other kind of peculiar markets form, commodity futures, currency futures. And at that point, the financial system, which has now been liberated from its earlier condition of repression, starts to create all kinds of instruments by which you can actually invest in those instruments and make a lot of money very fast in these money, which is a sort of fictitious side of the economy, which is actually about these asset bubbles. So what we get from the 1970s onwards is a series of asset bubbles which are absorbing vast amounts of capital, and out of which people are withdrawing vast amounts of capital. And then the question really arises, well, what does that capital really mean? What does that money really mean? And who's backing it up? And all these sorts of questions start to arise in the 1990s. Is there anything real there? And so this is, if you like, the beginnings of the formation of the present crisis. Now, I've argued that actually working class people were being pushed more and more to go to the debt economy. And by the time we get into the 1990s, that has been extended to such a point that the problem of absorbing capital surplus starts to come into the picture. Now, part of my theoretical apparatus is to emphasize very much that throughout the history of capital, there's always been a capital surplus absorption problem. And the capital surplus absorption problem says, well, you've got to find profitable places to put your capital once you've got your profit at the end of the day and you start to reinvest. So you need to find a new place to go, and therefore the system has to expand. So there is therefore this mandate almost that growth becomes absolutely essential to the survival of capitalism, and growth at a certain compound rate becomes essential. So how is compound growth of a minimum of 3%, or better still, if you do 5 or 7 or 8%, how could that compound rate of growth be assured when actually there's this sort of difficulty of finding real places to put your money? And part of the answer here, historically, has been urbanisation. And since this is a metropolitan kind of thing, I better talk a little bit and integrate the urbanisation. And And this is actually a very significant thing. And I learned this through the Paris study, that in 1848 there's a crisis of over-accumulation of capital, where there's surplus capital and surplus labour side by side, and nobody knows what to do with it. And there is this major crisis, which has political ramifications. The revolutionary situation breaks out, all kinds of mayhem goes on, and at the end of the day, they get this guy, Louis Bonaparte, who comes in and becomes elected president and declares himself emperor. Now, Louis Bonaparte was sufficiently smart to know that he wouldn't last very long as emperor unless he could put capital back to work and put labour back to work. Now, how was he going to do that? And I think what happened in Second Empire Paris is just a very interesting tale of how that was done, partly through an urbanisation project. This wasn't the only thing going on. I mean, French capital started to do things like build the Suez Canal, build railroads down through, into Lebanon and all kinds of places like that. But the Paris reconfiguration was a big piece of it, and Haussmann was brought in to do that. Now, here's the interesting thing. In order to do this, you couldn't do it by just sort of letting money lie around in dribs and drabs everywhere. So one of the things that you needed in order to mobilize the money was a reform of financial institutions. And this always is significant. And as I mentioned back in the 1970s, the reform of financial institutions was crucial to the revival of capitalism. Now, what happened was that the Saint-Simonians of the 1920s, 1930s argued that associated capitals were essential to creating magnificent public works and all the rest of it. And this was a utopian left project. People trained in that project came into the Second Empire situation and said, we have to find a way to associate capital. So they set up these new financial institutions, which are credit institutions, and these new banking institutions took small blocks of savings and assembled them in vast quantities, and then allowed that money to be poured into rather large-scale kinds of projects. It could be sort of building the omnibus system, the gas system, all those sorts of things. So the financial institution reform was important. The state finance part of that was also significant, and armed with that, they could then go on and rebuild Paris. And in rebuilding Paris, of course, they very soon found themselves with relatively full employment, and full employment which was associated with the full employment of capital as well. In other words, you created the opportunity for utilization of surplus capital through an urbanization project. And this was debt financed by these new financial institutions. And this was, if you like, a critical means that actually led into the revival of the French economy and the Parisian economy from the crisis of 1848. But it wasn't only about just building the infrastructures, building the boulevards and all of those houses you still see in Paris as you go down the Boulevard Sebastopol or wherever, It wasn't only about that. The other thing that was going on was that actually the whole matter of daily life was being transformed by the way in which a new society was being built, and consumerism, and so much of it around the notion of spectacle, was also being constructed. For instance, the court. Napoleon made a very glamorous court, but he absolutely insisted that the old uniforms be thrown away and everybody wear a completely new design of court attire. Now this, of course, led all of the seamstresses in Paris to move from a situation of unemployment to full employment over a period of about 6 months. And then the fashion industry kicks in, and suddenly people are going on those vast crinoline dresses and all this kind of stuff you see in Monet and Manet paintings, and crazy kind of stuff like that. And they're parading on the street, so the spectacle, and then the department stores come in, and the gas lighting comes in, and suddenly Paris becomes a great tourist centre, the city of light, and the whole kind of lifestyle, and the opera, and all this sort of stuff. In other words, you're not merely talking about the reconfiguration of the physical infrastructure, you're also talking about a transformation of lifestyle which has political consequences. And here I think there's another theme which becomes very important to me, which is the way in which the transformation of urban environments has real serious impacts upon political consciousness and political thinking. if you unleash the dialectic that Marx talks about when he says, well, in making the world, we make ourselves. If you make the world a certain way, you make yourselves in a certain way. The interesting question was, to what degree was the remaking of the Parisian world about remaking of self, and in the remaking of self, remaking of political subjectivities? And actually the big contest over political subjectivities in Second Empire Paris was there, and there was, if you like, a revolt at the end in the Paris Commune, which is an attempt to actually attack the new forms of political subjectivity that were taken up in the new consumerism that was there in the Second Empire. So all of this is connected then to emerging from, using urbanization to emerge from the crisis. Now, I have argued that this is a terribly important issue, that the way in which the problems of the 1930s were resolved after 1945 was largely through suburbanization of the United States and Robert Moses and all the rest of it, which was not only about building infrastructures and building the suburbs, it was also about a transformation of lifestyle and a transformation of the kinds of commodities which people needed to fuel that lifestyle. And of course it carried with it certain transformations of political subjectivities, which we're still living with today, because if you want to look at some of the areas of political reaction, where do you go? So it's, this is a world which is constructed. And I say to my students, everybody has this notion that there's an infinite appetite for trinkets and baubles, as Adam Smith once said, but how come the trinkets and baubles include the category lawnmower? And in 1945, if you were a smart entrepreneur, you'd start making lawnmowers, and pretty soon you see everybody trotting around mowing their lawns, and there's no collective lawnmower down So this is a very important process. And guess what? To the degree we're coming out of the crisis this time, what is happening in China? You have a huge infrastructure investment project in China. There is a huge urbanization project in China. Shanghai property prices doubled last year. There's a huge speculative boom going on in the urban environment in China. This is a classic way in which you get out of crises. And to some degree, we see this during the 1970s and 1980s, a transformation in the nature of urbanization, which is very much about absorbing surplus capital through an urbanization project that are very much about gentrification, condominium construction, and all the rest of it. And I always kind of parallel Mike Davis's tale about cities and slums. Every city I go to that's supposed to be a city of slums has a huge kind of construction project going on, condominiums all over the place. You're in Mumbai or something like that, and you see these things powering all over the place. And in Santiago in Chile, and there's this whole area called Little Manhattan there, and so everywhere you go, the cities have been construction sites. But it's not only construction sites, it's also been about the transformation of lifestyle. And my favorite thing here was in the 1960s, you would not see a sidewalk cafe in New York City. Now the place is littered with them. Why on earth anybody would want to sit in a cafe on 2nd Avenue? Traffic roaring past you, pretending you're in some nice little Parisian kind of what fantasy world are you in? And everybody yells about smoking, but what about the fumes? Petrol fumes, diesel fumes that surround it. Anyway. So, look at the cafe, sidewalk cafe culture in New York City. And this is also about turning the street into a cyber spectacle, much as happened in Second Empire Paris. So that, you see all these young kids, you go down the village, you see all these young kids parading around in fashions, and everybody has to have I've got a 20-year-old daughter, I know what this is like. And she goes down in the village with the same dress 3 nights running, and she's dead, and she's just kind of find another one, it's kind of awful. But this is a world that gets constructed. So the transformation of urbanization is integral to all of this process. But the downside of it is, and the interesting side, one of the reasons why investments in urban infrastructures and investments in urban transformation are so good is because it takes a long time to figure out whether they're productive or not. So they take a long time to build, and they take a long time to come online, and it takes 8 or 10 years before you figure out whether you've done a good thing or not. And during that time, you just sit there waiting and hoping that the development's going to come, and people are going to come into the condos, and they're going to settle in the new shopping malls, and they're going to come to the new multiplexes or whatever. So it takes a while for all of that to sort of settle down and figure out whether things are working or not. And generally what happens is that there comes a point where it becomes clear in many instances that there's been serious overproduction, overaccumulation in the urban process. And the urbanization process has gone too far too far. And when that happens, you get a crisis which attaches to a crisis originating out of this investment strategy in urbanization. Now, this point gets overlooked again and again and again. I hear a lot, for example, about this is a subprime crisis. And I kind of say, no, it's not a subprime crisis. This is a crisis of urbanization. And you should look at it in terms of a crisis of urbanization. And we've been through this, by the way, before. For example, only just recently, just in about the last 6 months, there have been 2 major research studies which have come out of the National Bureau of Economic Research, which has gone back and looked at the role of real estate investment in the 1920s. And guess what? Speculative real estate investment in the 1920s took off. It was an asset boom, and it was highly located, and particularly in commercial property. It was basically New York and Chicago, and that was it, and a few other small places. And most of that went bust about a year to 6 months before the big crash in 1929. And so these, and then in housing, the same thing happened. So there was a housing boom which went on in the 1920s, which was absorbing the surplus capital, and the housing boom collapsed. And then the commercial property boom collapsed just shortly after the housing boom collapsed. And what these researchers say is, you know, if we had been aware of this, and if writings about the Great Depression had understood the role of all of this leading into the Great Depression, policymakers would never have allowed the housing boom to go on in the way it did, and Greenspan would never have said the kind of things he said about, oh, this is just a bit of froth in a few housing markets. No, he never have said it. He would have said, this is a dangerous situation. But the irony is, it's always been a dangerous situation. You know, when people go back and they look at the crash of 1973, you know, the general story is, well, it was all about oil and oil price, and it was the war, and you know, in the October War, and the oil embargo and the oil price hike that caused the crash. No, the crash was going at least 6 months before that in property markets. And you know, I had some graphs of this in the condition of post-modernity, and I reproduced them in the Enigma, kind of showing what happened to the value of real estate investment trusts in the United States, what happened to property market shares on the London stock market in 1973. They were going like this, and then boom, they crashed, big time. And that played a very significant role in the formation of the difficulties of the 1970s. In particular, it played in, as you can see again right now, into the fiscal crisis of New York City in the 1970s, because, you know, fiscal crisis is generated by falling property prices, and people can't pay their property taxes and all that kind of thing. So the property taxes go down, and the fiscal crisis becomes shifted, as it were, from this area of property to the state apparatus. Now, again, what's interesting about this is you then start to say to yourself, well, how many times over the last 30 years have we seen crises which have actually emanated from the landed property market? What happened to Japan? Japan was booming like crazy in the 1980s. It was the big economy. Everybody was kind of saying, we've got to be like Japan. Then all of a sudden it blew up. What blew up? Land prices. So the whole thing was being brought down. And the graph of land prices in Japan is still heading downward. Japan is still trying to recover from a crisis which was located in the land market. In 1992, there was a Nordic property speculative crisis. And the result of that is the Swedes had to nationalize their banks because of excessive property market speculation. And in this nationalizing their banks, they did what, you know, what all good sort of governments do. They cleaned up all of the mess and then gave it back at a discount price to all of these people who messed up the situation in the first place. So there you have another. And then, of course, we had our own savings and loan crisis. Remember that? Well, we all know that. People have amnesia in this. Yeah. It was a huge savings and loan crisis, and the government had to put up $200 billion. Got back a lot of it, or most of it actually. Had to put in about $200 billion, and over 1,500 institutions went bankrupt between about 88 and 1994 during the savings and loan crisis, a huge crisis which was based mainly in not so much in housing but mainly in commercial property ventures. So actually, when you look back, what you see is a pattern in which the blowing up of urban investment actually becomes a very significant aspect of crisis formation. And that, of course, was very much the tale this time around. What was it that started to push people into the property market, speculative boom? And when the stock market crashed in 2001, wiping out about $7 trillion in share values, there's a big problem. Where are you going to put your money? There's again surplus capital absorption problem. Where is it going to go? And what are you going to do with it? And it started to go, the interest rate comes down and it starts to go into property. And there's a lot of evidence now that actually Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were actually pushed by political power to loosen as much as they could the sort of credit arrangements, and the whole kind of subprime thing kind of picks up. Now, that began with relatively benign intentions in the Clinton administration, sort of way back in the 1990s. But by the time it gets to around 2001, it starts to become sort of an inferno of predatory practices in which people are using surplus capital to make quick profits, not out of the mortgage itself, but out of the fees and all the other things that go whenever you get a property transaction. So that's what people were after, not so much the mortgage, and they were then packaging the mortgages, and the banks came up, as we know, the familiar story, put them in these investment vehicles and then sell them off to unsuspecting investors all around the world. Now the point about this was that actually what you see going on in real estate during these years is that finance capital is operating at both ends of the housing market. It is both funding the developer to go build tract housing, and it's funding people who probably can't pay back to buy the property at the end of the day. So you've got a neat kind of thing where finance capital is operating at both ends, both in terms of supply and demand, and you have a kind of, that's why I say it ends up with a Ponzi kind of character, Ponzi scheme. Now, this is the sort of thing that classically does lead to a bubble and it explodes, and it did. So my point here is to say that actually the dynamics of this has to be integrated with an understanding of urbanization processes. And when I made the kind of comment of what is it that I can bring to my understanding of the situation and the crisis formation, that's one of the things that I try to integrate into the enigma, is to kind of say, you just can't treat this as epiphenomenal on the side. You have to treat this as something which is actually pretty foundational and dynamic, interior to the dynamics of capitalism. And by the way, one of the results of this is that, of course, urban life is being changed by these processes. That is, we are not changing urban life in a way that we like. It is being changed for us by the dynamic of these processes, of people using their surplus capital to dump it in urban situations and rebuild and build all those things they build, some of which are okay and some of which are dreadful. And so our lives, if you like, are sort of bound up within this process, and we have to then to recognize that and try to get hold of the urban process, as it were, and redirect it as part of a revolutionary strategy. So the crisis this time then was a crisis in which the financial system was solving the effective demand problem largely by giving credit to people who couldn't really use it wisely, and then having them spend it a great deal on the urban dynamic and within the urban dynamic. Now, there was a lot of things that went on there, the particularities of it. There were situations in which people would buy and then kind of sell and flip properties and make money out of this situation while the going was good. And low-income people could do that. I mean, if you could buy something for zero down payment and very low interest rate and hold it for 3 years and then sell it for $20,000 more than you paid for it, then you make $20,000. Not a bad deal. And if they could do that on Wall Street, why can't ordinary people do it? Why not? So some of that was going on. So the dynamics of this crisis then led into it this way. Now, here you come also back to the geography. Actually, the predatory practices were going on in old central cities areas during the 2000s, so 2004, 2005. If you were in Baltimore, you would have seen it going on around you all the time. It was targeting particularly low-income populations, particularly African American, with a very strong gender component in which African American single-headed household women were also caught up in this dynamic. And one of the things that's being held out to them, you can have secure housing with this, and they find they couldn't last, and then they get foreclosed upon. So the estimates are, even before the major crisis broke out, something like $40 billion has been lost in the African American population through these predatory practices. This is what I call accumulation by dispossession, big time, big time. And the interesting thing was, in 2007, 2007, Wall Street gave itself bonuses of around $40 billion. And it seemed to me it's very interesting. We've lost $40 billion down here, and suddenly the bonuses of $40 billion have appeared up here. Now, I can't show that it was actually that money that got from here and went up there, but when 40 billion losses are down there and 40 billion unreasonable bonuses are sort of up there, it says, well, why not just connect them and say, look, there's a relationship between these two. and of course, $40 billion was a tremendous, $30 or $35 billion on Wall Street was a tremendous amount of payoff for crashing the world's financial system. I'd like to fail so dramatically and get paid that amount for it. So now we've got this situation where this is then caught, and of course all the mortgage stuff has caught. Now, again, one of the things that is surprising is that the amount of US debt is huge, but about 40% of the total debt is in the mortgage market. I mean, again, you cannot divorce these kinds of things from the nature of the macro dynamic. But we're so often given a picture of the macro dynamic that doesn't integrate these sorts of aspects into it, that you lose track of what's really happening, and you get these sort of tales. Well, should we do a Keynesian thing or should we not? Now, this brings me back, if you like, to the whole kind of question of exactly what is going on in terms of the crisis. There are two moments which stick in my mind. One was the moment when Lehman Brothers went belly. To me, there's still an immense mystery as to why that happened and how that happened. And there have been hearings on it, and emails have been uncovered and this kind of thing, and it's still very obscure to me exactly why that happened. The official claim by the Federal Reserve and the Treasury was they didn't have the legal means. Frankly, that's bullshit. I mean, they didn't have the legal means to interfere in Bear Stearns or Merrill Lynch, but they did. Why didn't they interfere in the same way with Lehman? The other was, it was a political, one other possibility, it was really a political problem. That actually most of America was getting most of the American population was getting really exercised by, the sinners on Wall Street. And, McCain's running a political campaign, and so they figured they better punish some of the sinners on Wall Street. What better way than to sort of send Lehman crashing down and say, see? And then scare everybody to see, when they saw what happened to their 401ks, even in the heartlands, they decided, well, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. So this is another way. And the other thing that happened through the Lehman crash was the crisis was sent globally. That is, the United States exported the crisis globally, a big time, and there's certain benefits that come from the United States of making it go global. If, for example, East and Southeast Asia in 1997-98 could have sent the crisis global, I think they would have done. The United States was really using all of its power to stop it, and held it off. Where there's no power to stop the United States sending it global, so it was sent global. And as it's sent global, what happens? Well, all kinds of other places start to get into a mess. The export-driven economies start to get into a mess. Losses of jobs in China and Taiwan and all this kind of thing. Those people who've been stupid enough to invest in those investment vehicles suddenly find they're worthless and they can't pay their police force in northern Norway or something like that. So it spreads all over the place with all kinds of differential effects. And since then, we've had this sort of roiling crisis, but behind it there lies a very simple principle. That is, we are not coming out of this crisis in any way different from the general neoliberal orthodoxy. And the neoliberal orthodoxy was established in 1982 in relationship to the Mexican debt crisis, in which what happened was that the Mexicans were about to declare bankruptcy, and the US Treasury grabbed the IMF and went down to Mexico and said, you can't do that, because if you declare bankruptcy, the New York investment banks are going to go under, and we can't let that happen. So we're going to bail you out so that you can pay off the New York investment bankers. But in return, being bailed out, and by the way, you need to be bailed out because if you go into default, you'll never get another penny of investment forever. You know, that kind of storyline. You've got to visit austerity on your population. So the living standards of Mexicans declined by about 25% in 5 years in order to pay off the New York investment bankers. That's what it boiled down to, and that was the strategy. Now look what we have done. We bailed out the financial institutions, and we bailed out the people who run them, so that they're wealthy as always. In fact, some of them are making much more money now than they've ever made before. The wealthier become much wealthier through a crisis, as often happens. As Andrew Mellon, I think he said, in a crisis, assets return to their rightful owners, i.e. him. And I think this has been going on. Now this then creates a situation in which, okay, you can bail them out, but at whose expense? The state's expense. So now you've got a fiscal crisis of the state. And what's the answer to the fiscal crisis of the state? Tax the rich or subject to the poor? Well, what are we doing? What are we doing? Serious austerity, right? Austerity, that's it, big name, austerity. So the people are going to have to pay for what the bankers did. And the bankers are not going to have to pay anything. And this is what happened in Mexico. So if it happened in Mexico, why can't it happen here? Huh? What's wrong with that? I mean, and actually some people in Latin America right now are kind of chortling at the fact that you're getting the equivalent of an IMF structural adjustment program. and it's not even administered by the IMF. It's self-inflicted. So neoliberal orthodoxy is doing well right now, and of course it's contagious and actually deeply implanted in Europe anyway. So you see, actually Britain's going exactly the same way. Now the interesting thing about this is it doesn't get you out of the crisis of capitalism, but it does actually save the capitalist class. Now, capitalist class interest and the future of capitalism are not necessarily the same things. And right now, what you're seeing, it seems to me, in this country in particular, is the capitalist class is saving itself at the expense of actually destroying capitalism. And this is a real kind of interesting thing to do. And it's not the first time that this has happened. Actually, historically, individual capitalists operating in their own interests have often acted in such a way as to destroy the coherence of capitalism. And factional groupings right now, particularly the Party of Wall Street, which is protecting itself, is prepared to send the rest of the country to hell in order to preserve its power. But it's been doing that all along. Who was it that was facilitating the deindustrialization of the United States? If it wasn't the Party of Wall Street. They connived at the deindustrialization of the United States. And in so doing, of course, they have actually kind of wrecked the industrial capacity of the United States and of course, have created this situation where unemployment becomes serious. Now, here are a couple of interesting things. A recent report of the IMF showed that, about one half of the lost jobs in all of the advanced capitalist worlds are located in the United States. But actually, 7 million jobs have been, net loss in the United States. The other thing is that the last 3 recessions in the United States, in 1991, 1992, and this one, all of them have been followed by what are called jobless recoveries. And we are in a process of jobless recovery, except this one is not even jobless recovery, it's an increasingly jobless recovery. And in fact, you can see why. Firms are actually getting back into profitability by actually engaging in more wage repression, more layoffs, more short time, more, wage givebacks. Look at the contract now with General Motors. New people joining General Motors. Look at their contract with wages. And so here you have the situation. Now, the one part of the world that's not following this recipe is, of course, China. I mentioned that earlier. They're actually engaging in a full-fledged kind of Keynesian program of massively financed, debt financed to some degree, investments. Not only 600 billion putting into infrastructures, but they've also instructed their banks, because the party controls a lot of what the banks do, in ways that, Obama can't control what the banks do in this country because the banks control him. But in China, the party still has a big say on how the banks behave. Well, they're telling the banks basically lend to everybody. and lend to local projects as much as you can, and that has actually brought back employment. At the same time, unemployment has been not exactly solved, but stabilised, and at the same time, what we're starting to see is that actually the government, and I don't know whether it's because they've been forced to or they've decided to, allows strikes to occur. So you suddenly see rising wages in China. And guess what? Through all of this, China's growing at 7 or 8%. In other words, they're coming out of it fine. And anybody who feeds China is also coming out of it fine. Latin America has come out of this fairly easily because it switched its trading pattern to China. Australia didn't feel the crisis at all because of its raw material, supplying raw materials to China. So anywhere in the world that's oriented to China is doing all right these days. Even Germany, which is the one place in Europe which has revived reasonably well, is based on the export trade to China. So that actually what we're seeing is a geographical shift, a hegemonic shift, as Giovanni Arrighi calls it, to the China situation. So what we're seeing then is one part of the world coming out of this with the old neoliberal formulations, partly based on ideology, partly based on capitalist class power, and another part of the world coming out of it in a much more pragmatic way, maybe even fueled by a kind of a Keynesian theory, I don't know, and coming out of it in rather sort of positive ways. Now, the difficulty here is the question of will the China boom continue? And to the degree that it's a classic boom of the sort that we saw in, say, the 1950s in this country, with the building of the interstate highway system, building of the suburbs, the reconfiguration of the US political and infrastructural space, to the degree that all of that went on for about 15 years in the United States, in a relatively stable kind of way, and stabilized capitalism, it could go on for 15 years in China. Or it could actually blow up much faster. In other words, this is a dangerous situation, and my guess is that at some point down the line, China is going to be the epicenter of the next crisis, in the same way that Southern California and that, this part of the world was the epicenter of the last crisis. So we're going to see something of that sort down the line, unless we watch out. Now this all then raises another kind of final question, which is, why do we want to continue with a system that works in this way? and there are some compelling reasons which I try to lay out in the book about, compound growth forever, even if it's a minimal kind of 3%, is putting too much stress, all sorts of reasons on environment, economy, and possibilities. And I think it's no accident that so much of the expansion that occurred since the 1970s has been of a fictitious sort, because the possibility of real expansions wasn't there. And if that was the case over the last 30 years, it's going to be even harder over the next 30 years. 3% growth revival right now requires to find $1.5 trillion worth of profitable investment opportunities. If you grow at 3% compound growth, by the time you get to 2030, you're talking about finding $3 trillion worth of profitable investment opportunities. In other words, I think we've got to an inflection point in the history of capitalism where something's got to give, and something's got to give big time. And nobody's really willing to talk about it, and nobody's really willing to kind of actually contemplate the idea. Not that there's some final crisis of capitalism, because there's not going to be a final crisis. They'll continue to hang on to their power until they're dispossessed. And it's up to us to dispossess them. And they're not going to give it up on their own. They never have and never will. And similarly, capitalism is not going to crash in the way of a huge crash. We're going to get these grumbling crises of dispossession here, devaluation and disinvestment there. We'll probably get minor wars and all those kinds of things somewhere else. So we're looking at a rather bleak future, a series of jobless recoveries in this country. I mean, how many more jobless recoveries are you going to have to go through until you start to say this system sucks? And it needs to change, and radically change. Now, what can it change into? Well, it has to change into something that is not based on capital accumulation forever. That is, you've got to start to think about a situation in which the social surplus is controlled socially rather than by private interests. Neoliberalism is about privatizing the control over the social surplus. We have to claim collective control over that social surplus, not necessarily in the state apparatus, but find other means to try to exercise collective control over it. That means there has to be a program of transition towards something called socialism, communism, or whatever you want to call it, which is radically different from the way in which we live now. And the big agenda for the left, and I think we're not thinking in these broad enough terms, is to try to define what that transition would look like, how it would work through all of those different moments of social change of the sort that transformed feudalism into capitalism. We have to think about how to reorganize institutional arrangements, transform daily life, transform mental conceptions in such a way that we move into a different kind of world, in which we can actually look towards the idea that people can be fed, housed, clothed in reasonable kinds of ways according to their own kind of cultural ideas and prescriptions. That is what we have to look to. But that takes a lot of thinking and getting out of the typical ways in which this crisis is explained. We have to come up with a different explanatory form. That's what I was trying to do in the mission of capital. And I hope it's going to stick, and I hope that somebody's going to learn from it. I'm not arguing that it's the truth by any means. It's a statement, a beginning statement of a discussion and a debate, particularly around the issue of organisational forms that are going to be involved in the transitional process. So it's a beginning point of the debate rather than me kind of laying down the law about it. I'm not sure that everything I say in there is correct, but it's a good place to start to look at a much broader kind of question of the transition from this kind of capitalism that we are in to something which is radically different, and much more humane, just, and plausible than the system we now have. So thank you very much. Everything's oriented around pumping money into the ultra rich, and you kind of go, isn't this a democracy where we go out there, but of course we do have this problem. The two parties are the party of Wall Street.
A little while ago, a couple of weeks ago, there was an article about the situation in Cuba, and supposedly Fidel spoke about how the Cuban model wasn't working for Cuba anymore. And it seemed to be sort of a moment of sort of, kick them while they're down, or whatever. What's your take on the situation in Cuba, and do you think their model doesn't work anymore?
I'm not an expert on Cuba. It depends what you mean by working. I mean, if I was Latin American, I'd rather live under the Cuban healthcare system than I would under any other. I think their education system is better than anything else, and there are a lot of problems about how resources get allocated. And I think, again, one of the interesting issues for any transition is to look at the role of market and the role of money and how that can be transformed. I think one of the difficulties with actually existing communisms is that they never really took this dialectical argument I'm making about processes of social change and keep the revolution in motion. They often got to the point and stuck. And I think human societies to exist in a world where, as Alfred North Whitehead once said, all of nature, including human nature, is about the perpetual pursuit of novelty. And I think actually it's kind of an interesting idea. I think some of that gets lost in revolutionary situations and communist situations. So I think it was a critique of past communist practices, including those in Cuba, but I don't write them all off. I think there are many people who are now in many countries who were once communists who are regretting very much. I remember Boris Kagarlitsky saying to me, the revolution was so great, we all felt so fantastic, we felt we were getting on an airliner and going to the West. And we get on and we're all cheering and happy, and then the airliner takes off and then the pilot says, welcome to this flight to Burkina Faso. And we all said, what? We thought we were going to Paris. But, so I don't think everything measured is, I think we have to go back and look at actually existing communisms as they were constructed and look at some of their good points as well as their bad points and their failures.
Yeah, so you were speaking about how the sort of proletariat in the factories disappearing, or it's disappeared. So the new agency for change would be in the city builders and city maintenance, or people, I guess, in the state apparatus. But as far as like my father actually, was one of those city maintenance people. Who's a plumber in the school district here in the East Bay. And he's never had a college education, and he sort of just went to, plumbing school and got his apprenticeship and became a plumber. And he's now one of those people. And when I try to talk to him about these ideas, he's not very receptive of it. So I think the challenge is like getting the ideas that are going on in this room into the heads of people like my father. And what would you say to do that?
Around the dinner table, you know. Do that. I mean, I used to have that problem with my mother. She used to say things like, well, we can't do away with capitalists because they create jobs. And you kind of go, well, but there are other ways to create jobs other than having capitalists. Oh, no, we have to keep the capitalists. So, yeah, I mean, you always have those problems. But I didn't say, by the way, that it's a new situation. I think what's interesting is if you look at revolutionary movements historically, and you look at the people who made them, how often the city builders were part of those revolutionary movements. In the Paris Commune, for example, the builders and the stonemasons were very much part of it. In other words, the revolutionary impulse doesn't necessarily always come from the factories, it can come from other places. And I think that's always been the case, but I think it's been downplayed in the way in which the history of the class struggle has sometimes been written and understood. So my argument is that these questions which we're talking about do not need to be reevaluated just across the board, both in terms historically, but also in terms of very much in terms of the present situation. There is the case. I mean, when I say the proletariat has disappeared, it's disappeared. The form has not totally disappeared from the United States, obviously. But of course, it's very present in China, and I think it's very interesting to look at some of the movements that are factory-based movements that are emerging in China. And I think that the state of class struggle and the protest in China is going to be very, very influential on the course of human history and what they think, maybe rather more important than what your father thinks. And so we have to concede that there's a dynamic going on up there, which we're not. In some ways, even privy to understanding very well.
Could you talk a little bit about the possibility of political redistribution?
The politics of what?
Redistribution.
Redistribution.
Yeah, because I have been experiencing many land reform movements, which is, it's easy to imagine to take over the land that previously controlled by the big landholder. But thinking about the money accumulation, it's very hard to imagine how to redistribute the money that accumulated through the historical times.
Well, I mean, you're obviously an expert on this, so you're the one to answer the question. I haven't looked very much at the land reform movements, but again, the politics of redistribution are terribly important, and also this comes back to the kind of questions of what kinds of legal arrangements exist which surround the sort of land redistribution scheme. I mean, is it going to be a redistribution scheme which is a sort of pure private property, or what kind of redistribution are we talking about? Is it a collective form of redistribution? I don't know. I think the institutional forms start to be foundational. And the variable, the redistributive impact will depend very much on the nature of those institutional arrangements.
David, maybe we'll take one last question.
Okay. We go way at the back there.
Yeah, so I'm going to represent for the pioneer side. So can you elaborate a little bit more on your distinction between the crisis not as a subprime crisis, but as a crisis in urbanization? I mean, what's the analytic upshot of making that distinction? It seems like two different ways to describe relatively the same phenomenon.
No, because when you call it a subprime crisis, you could actually think about what kind of subprime loans would exist, credit cards, and all those sorts of things. So subprime is not confined to the urban at all. So you could talk about subprime in all sorts of different ways. But in this case, what we're talking about is a form of lending, which is a form of lending which became absolutely crucial given the nature of the urban development that was undergoing. I mean, it was a sort of tract housing and building around, San Diego and Stockton and all those kinds of things, the Central Valley and all the rest of it, which was could only be fueled by subprime lending. And the question is, did you have subprime lending because people thought subprime lending was a good idea, or did you have subprime lending because of that urban dynamic? And part of it has to do with the urban dynamic, which is driven, by the way, and I didn't talk about this, it's driven, of course, very much by speculation on land values and speculation on property values. And you speculate on land values and property values in ways that sort of speculate on the value of a car, for example. So you're dealing with a different kind of commodity. Land is not a commodity like any other. It's a very particular kind of commodity. So the connection, if you like, between the speculative boom and subprime lending. For instance, if subprime lending was confined just to auto finance, it would have a completely different dynamic than the fact that it's actually entered into a relationship to the urbanization process. So I think there's a very important reason to make the analytic distinction, particularly over the time horizon which is involved in investment, and the nature of the fixed capital of the land which is involved, which is a different theoretical kind of question than the subprime lending to buy an automobile, which has a certain lifetime and then disappears. The land doesn't disappear; it accumulates in time. So I think this sort of involved, which makes it a very different proposition to get into subprime lending on land and property, as opposed to subprime lending in any other form. So it's not just about subprime lending, it's about subprime lending connected to a particular kind of asset, Because one of the reasons that theoretically at least the banks are willing to go into it in a way is the land is going to presumably retain its value. And one of the ways in which people are now responding is of course to go out and buy out foreclosed properties of land and hold them, warehousing, warehousing of the asset. On the theory that at some point or other this is going to turn around and the buildings will come back and be retained to get against that. So it's a entirely different proposition when you connect to the urban process. So, okay, we leave it there?
Yes, thank you all for being here.
And of course there have been thousands of books produced on the crisis, lots of insights from insiders and some from outsiders. And I thought, well, what could I say that would be a bit distinctive? And this came to me actually in the process of writing the book when there was this wonderful moment when Her Majesty the Queen went to the London School of Economics to open some building. And she turned to the economists and said, how come you guys didn't see this whole thing coming? She didn't say it like that, and then she would not. But, she being a feudal monarch, I guess, demanded an answer. It's the kind of question that I would have of them, but they wouldn't listen to me, even bother to answer me, or you for that matter. So the British Academy put together a whole group of top economists and the Governor of the Bank of England and all that kind of thing, and they deliberated seriously for 6 months or more, and then they wrote Her Majesty a letter in which they said, well, we were working very diligently on all the bits and pieces of how the economy works, and we were really doing a very, very good job, people dedicating their lives to this, but somehow or other in all of this we missed something called systemic risk. And that immediately led to me, and I thought, well, what do they mean by systemic risk? And just recently, about 2 months ago, the IMF produced a paper in which it said the study of systemic risk is in its early stages. And the other ex-chief economists from the World Bank kind of said, well, we don't really know what systemic risk is, so we have to really, start to really reconceptualize things. Now, to me, of course, systemic risk is probably the most important thing you should be looking at in any situation. And to me, translated into my language, systemic risks means the internal. I had to push that all aside and actually come up with a system of thinking about what I call the blockages and potential crisis points in the circulation process of capital, and you can identify a whole number of these, any one of which can produce a crisis. Sometimes you get a crisis which looks like an underconsumption crisis. Sometimes you get one which looks like a profit squeeze crisis, and others it looks like a sort of a technologically driven aspect of crisis. But in other words, I was driving to the point of saying there is no one singular notion of crisis we can point to. There is a system which has a whole series of blockage points, and each one of them is crisis prone, and I'll get back to what that means in a minute. This has not been terribly well received by many Marxists, and I can understand why. I mean, if you spend 30 years of your life arguing for the falling rate of profit theory, you try and squeeze the current crisis into the falling rate of profit theory, and frankly, I don't think it works. And I think that when I come along and say, well, of course it doesn't work, people don't feel very happy about that, so there's some criticism. The second area that I had to reflect upon is the notion of the proletariat and agencies of political transformation. And I've always taken the position that I thought this notion that somehow the proletariat was confined to factory labour, which was creating, of course, amongst North American Marxists the real difficulty, the problem that a lot of factory labour was disappearing, so the proletariat was disappearing before their eyes, and then they are left with no agent to actually create historical change. And this, of course, has been a very important transformation in American life. I was reminded of this the other day when I was in Baltimore, and I met a steel worker who was still working at Bethlehem Steel, and he reminded me that back in the late 1960s they employed 37,000 people at Bethlehem Steel. And actually at that time, if we wanted to do anything politically, we would go to the Steelworkers Union, and if we had good relations with the president, the local president of the Steelworkers Union, we could get a hell of a lot done. So it was a very interesting kind of moment. Well, now there are about 2,500 people working at Bethlehem Steel, and the whole plant is going to be closed on November 7th. So, that's what I mean by the proletariat disappearing. But I never felt comfortable, even in those days, of saying, well, that's where the real action is. I mean, I was interested not only in factory labour, but in, for example, all those people who are engaged in city building and city maintenance. There's a whole huge wage labour force out there which is engaged in that, and why aren't we talking about them as part of the proletariat? There's also, of course, all of those wage labourers who are involved in service industries and the like. So it always seemed to me that the conception of the proletariat was too narrow, really to work very well in terms of analysis. And secondly, I thought that the emphasis on the point of production, which is fundamental, particularly in a lot of theoretical Marxism, missed the point that a lot of politics occurs in the residency space, and that therefore I'd always tried to talk about class formation, both in the residency and also in the place of production. So to me, that had always been the case, but in this book I decided to come right out front and say, hey, forget about that, all that sort of usual kind of rhetoric about the proletariat in motion in the factories. Well, yeah, you may see some of that in China, but that's not what's going on around us, and in any case it's just not an adequate way to look at things, so I had to reformulate that, which again doesn't make great friends to you amongst the Trotskyist parties. The third modification was to really transform, go back and look at Marx's theory of social change and the dialectics of social change. And again, there are a lot of one-liners that people debate, all history is the history of class struggle, or the changes in the productive forces actually transform society, and that's, those sorts of things. But I went back, and since this was one of the virtues of teaching Marx every year for about the last 40 years, is that I've become very, very closely concerned with what he's actually talking about in the text. And when you actually look at the way in which he talks about the transition from feudalism to capitalism, you get a completely different theory of social change, which rests on what I would call a co-revolutionary movement or a co-evolutionary movement between different moments in the social process. And I identify, coming out of Marx's general framework, a number of these moments. There's the technological moment, which is important, which is not only hardware technology, but also organizational form. There is the relation to nature moment, there is the production moment, there is the social relations moment, there is the daily life moment, there's conceptions, the mental conception of the world, the institutional moment, and so forth. And you imagine all of these moments which have to shift and change if you're going to actually move from a feudal organisation to a capitalist organisation. But then I would argue that actually capitalism is internally dynamic and revolutionary, is constantly changing across all of those movements, all of those moments. And that the shift, for example, under neoliberalisation was a transformation of institutional arrangements, a transformation of technologies, a transformation of social relations, and of mental conceptions and all the rest of it. So that actually you would look at a co-revolutionary process internal to capitalism, which then transformed, if you like, the idea of revolutionary transformations moving away from capitalism into how do you guide this co-revolutionary movement, which is going on anyway, down different paths away from, if you like, the perpetuation of class power, the perpetuation and consolidation of that class power on a global stage. So that was, if you like, the third major modification that I had to make. So having, if you like, cruised my way through the thickets of Marxism and completely sort of disrupted a lot of general considerations, I then thought, well, okay, you can now set this to work to try to explain the actual dynamics of the crisis and what happened. Now, in explaining this, it seems to me that there are two aspects to it. One is the geographical aspect and one is the temporal aspect. And in the end, of course, you have to put those two together. The temporal aspect is that I began to see very clearly that the creation of the present crisis was very much a function of the way in which we came out of the last crisis. And the last crisis was set up in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And it was a crisis which you could understand in a number of ways by the way in which, again, a configuration of forces locked together conditions of capitalism. So I thought I might try and save the IMF a lot of trouble by presenting a very simple volume which would explain to them what systemic risk under capital was all about. And to my astonishment, about 3 weeks ago, I got a rather nice review from the book section of the IMF in-house document. And it kind of, it was rather nice. It said, it ended up by saying, well, do I buy his arguments? No, not yet. But should you buy this book? Definitely yes. So my hope is that I'm going to convert the IMF into understanding the internal contradictions of capitalism. But my own aim out of this was to actually exploit the occasion of this particular crisis to reflect a little bit on why capital is so crisis-prone in general, and then try to resituate this crisis against, if you like, a general interpretation of crisis formation under capitalism. Now this turned out to mean that I had to do this in a rather simplifying way, and in simplifying things I found myself having to sort of brush aside a lot of the sort of convoluted and sometimes complicated thickets of Marxian arguments about this and that and that and this. And the result is a sort of stripped down version of what I think Marxian thinking should be talking about in these times, and it's rather different from some of the other presentations that you might hear or understand. And there are three, I think, major modifications that I had to make before I could go ahead. The first was I had to actually reinterpret all of Marxian crisis theory. Typically that's been locked down into sort of a controversy over whether you should be talking about a profit squeeze, or whether you should be talking about a falling rate of profit, or whether you should be talking about an under-consumption crisis, which most Marxists would dismiss as being too Keynesian for comfort, so you can't talk about that.